Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the divine command theory, and I just want to clarify some of the sort of central concepts here and walk you through a little more slowly and step by step the actual Euthyphro dilemma itself, because it's a little bit crunchy and hard to get through in that Euthyphro dialogue that you read. So I want to make sure you get what the gist of the problem that Euthyphro presents in his answer to what morality is supposed to be. In the Euthyphro dialogue, he is talking primarily in terms of piety, so what's pious and impious. Technically, that means something like religious. It has a sort of more religious connotation, but in this context, it basically just means what is moral, what's good and what's bad. In ancient Greece, those two things were kind of more interchangeable than they are today, so the question of what's moral and the question of what is religiously right were sort of smushed together. But for the purpose of our conversation, what the question is what is the nature of morality and what it is that determines morality is what's up for debate in this dialogue. So the position that Euthyphro is defending is the position of the divine command theorist. And so the question again is, what makes morality moral? What makes good things good? What makes right things right? What is the nature of this kind of mysterious property of rightness? And what determines which things fall into that category? So Euthyphro's answer, and the answer of people who defend divine command theory, is, look, what it is to be moral, what it is to be right, is just to be selected by God as right, God or the gods. So Euthyphro is defending this position. He says, look, you're asking me what piety is or what rightness is. All it means to be right is for gods to determine that it's right. So the reason that murder is wrong is because the gods say it is. The reason that stealing from people is wrong is because the gods decided it was wrong. And you can sub in whatever sort of religious figure you want. Lots of religions basically have this kind of view about morality, that what it is for something to be morally right or morally wrong is just for God to have decided that that was the case. And so it's a pretty sort of tidy theory of what rightness is. It's quite easy in a sense to answer the question, okay, what things fall into the category of right and wrong? Look, you just look in whatever your favorite holy text is and the answers are there. So if it says in the book that murder is wrong, that's all it means for murder to be wrong. It's just that God decided it was. So it gives you a very kind of straightforward, easy procedure for figuring out what things are right. You just figure out what God says was right, and that's it. And so in that sense, it's really kind of neat and tidy and an easy kind of theory to follow. It's a kind of rule book. But there's this problem that arises in the dialogue, which is what Socrates is pointing out in his eternally snarky way, which is that, okay, the view of the divine command theorist is that morality is just what God prefers, or what is good is just what God says is good. So if you think that that's the case, if that's your story about what morality is, there's this problem that arises of now we have a question of what is it that makes God decide that certain things are good, certain things are right? Why does he make the decisions that he makes? So he says, okay, murder is wrong. God says murder is wrong, and so we know that murder is wrong because that's what it is for it to be wrong, is for God to have said so. But the problem that Socrates is presenting is, okay, look, how did God make that decision? What led him to make the decision that these things over here are wrong, these things over here are right? And no matter how you answer that question of how God arrived at that decision or the gods arrived at the decision, you run into problems. And this is where this dilemma, this sort of two-horn dilemma that arises, comes from. So on one hand of the dilemma, you've got this. Okay, so the question is, how does God decide that certain things are right and wrong? So one option is that God decides that certain things are right and wrong just for no reason at all. He just doesn't have any reasons. He just says, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, murder is wrong. And if that's the case, if God doesn't have any reasons for the decisions that he makes about what he's going to dub as right and wrong, that's weird because it turns out that morality just looks really arbitrary. Because if all it takes for something to be right and wrong is for God to just go eeny, meeny, miny, mo and choose it and say it's wrong, it seems like, at least in principle, it's possible that God could one day decide, okay, I've just decided I'm going to reverse everything. So the past several thousand years of human civilization was just opposite day, and now all of those things that I said were wrong, like murder and rape and theft and cheating and lying, all those things, I said that they were wrong, but now I've decided that they're right. So now murder is right, and rape is right, and cheating is right, and theft is right, and now things like keeping your promises and taking care of people and loving people and paying your dues and things like that, all of those things are wrong, just because I want to swap it now. According to divine command theory, that's all it would take for the set of things that are right and wrong to be swapped. It's just for God to have said, yeah, I'm kind of tired of that system now, I want to do something else. Because remember, according to divine command theory, all it means for something to be wrong is for God to have said that it's wrong. So if one day God decides, yeah, now I think murder is going to be wrong, murder is going to be right, that's all it would take to make it actually genuinely the case that murder is now right. So this is weird because most of us have the intuition that in this case, even if, God said, okay, yeah, I changed my mind, I'm just going to swap everything now, that murder would still be wrong, even though God just changed his mind about it. It doesn't seem like just the fact that God said, I think genocide is right now. Most of us think that doesn't make genocide right. It's still wrong, even after that kind of change of heart that God has. And the reason we have this intuition, I think, is because we have some sort of prior sense about what kinds of things count as right and wrong. And we just sort of generally think God wouldn't decide that genocide was right. He would never decide that because it's not right. Genocide just is wrong, and so God would never decide that something as horrific as genocide is suddenly not wrong anymore. We just don't think that that would happen. And the reason we don't think that would happen is because we have this kind of prior intuition about which things are candidates for being right and wrong, which means we have this kind of prior sense about what counts as right and wrong. So this picture of morality, according to which God kind of arbitrarily decides which things are right and wrong, doesn't really jive with our intuitions about how morality works. So remember, the divine command theory view, the basic view, is that what makes something right and wrong is that God decided that it was. So we said the first horn of this dilemma that the divine command theory faces is, okay, if it's the case that God just doesn't have any reasons for the choices that he made about what's right and wrong, then it looks like morality is this weird sort of arbitrary thing. It's very unstable. It could change at any moment if God decided he wanted to. The arbitrariness of morality doesn't really seem like it's coherent with our sense of how morality is supposed to work. So if it turns out that God has no reasons for choosing the things that he chooses to be right and wrong, morality looks like it's arbitrary. But you can imagine a scenario in which, okay, it's not the case that God has no reasons for choosing what's right and wrong. He has very good reasons, actually. He doesn't select them arbitrarily. He selects them based on some, reasons that are present to him. So we say, okay, God makes actually very thorough, well-informed decisions about what's right and wrong. He's got great reasons. And so when he says murder is wrong, it's because murder really is wrong, not just because he feels like saying it's wrong. There's some good reason why he made that decision. But if that's the case, and if it's the case that God's decisions about what's right and wrong are not arbitrary, but they're made for very good reasons, then it looks like what actually determined what was right and wrong was those reasons that God is responding to, rather than the mere fact that God wills something to be right or wrong. So if God chose murder as wrong for very good reasons, it looks like those reasons are really what did the work in determining morality, rather than God's will itself. So if if God doesn't have any reasons for his decisions about what's right and wrong, morality is just arbitrary. That doesn't seem like it's very satisfying. But if God does seem like he has reasons for choosing what's right and wrong, then it looks like those reasons are really the determiners of what is right and wrong rather than God's will just by itself. And if that's the case, then it turns out that the basic premise of divine command theory, which is that things are right and wrong just because God wills them to be, it looks like that's just not true anymore, because the reasons that they're right and wrong are whatever those reasons that God cited in determining what things fall into the category of right and wrong. So that's basically the Euthyphro dilemma, and that's what Socrates, this point that he kind of belabors is that, look, you're kind of putting the cart before the horse here. To say that things are wrong because God says that they're wrong is to get the order of operations reversed. Really, God says that things are wrong because they're already wrong, not the other way around. So he thinks this kind of order of explanation that Euthyphro and other people who defend this divine command theory are giving is reversed. So that's the basic Euthyphro dilemma, and it's a problem that continues to plague philosophers who contemporarily defend the divine command theory. And there have been lots of kind of flavors of divine command theory throughout the history of philosophy. In lots of different religions, this kind of theme of morality being determined by God's will crops up. And so anytime that's the answer to where does morality come from, what makes things right and wrong, if the answer is it's because God says they are, there's going to be this problem that arises, that either those decisions about what's right and wrong are arbitrary, or morality is actually just determined by something outside of God that he's responding to. Okay, so that's the sort of heart of the Euthyphro dilemma and of the divine command theory issue in terms of the actual explanation of morality. But there's this second problem that you watched the second Crash Course Philosophy video on, of the problem of evil. And so the problem of evil is taking a slightly different approach to this question of whether divine command theory is the right answer about where morality comes from. And usually the problem of evil is presented as an argument against the existence of God at all. So the problem of evil goes like this. It's very simple. God is supposed to have, at least in lots of sort of major religions, God is supposed to have these three attributes. So he's all-knowing or omniscient, he's all-powerful or omnipotent, and he's all-good or omnibenevolent. So God is all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing. And yet, in the world, there is an abundance of evil. There's an abundance of suffering. People treat each other poorly. There's war and famine and genocide and disease, and awful things happen just all the time, all day, every day. If that's the case, if that's true that there's just evil everywhere, and it looks like that's really hard to deny, how could it be the case that there is this God that's all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful? So there's three sort of possible options for how you might explain the fact that this evil still exists in the world. So one thing you could say is, okay, well, maybe God doesn't know about all of it, and that's why he doesn't stop it. But we already said that God is all-knowing, so if God is all-knowing, it can't be the case that there's evil that he doesn't know about, because he's supposed to know everything. Option two is, okay, maybe he knows about it, but he can't do anything about it. But again, we said God is all-powerful, so if he has the power to do anything, surely that includes the power to stop evil when he sees it. So if he knows about it, he's got to be able to do something about it if he's all-powerful, and he doesn't, so that can't be it. The third option is, okay, look, maybe he knows about the evil and he could do something to stop it, but he just doesn't want to. But again, this seems to violate this all good property that he has, which is, look, if God is all good, how could it be that he knows about and can do something to stop evil and just doesn't want to? If he's really all good, wouldn't he want to stop the evil that's in the world? So that's the basic problem of evil, is God's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, and yet there's this pervasive evil in the world. How can we reconcile these two things? So usually this is supposed to be presented as an argument against the existence of God. People say, okay, look, the fact that there's evil in the world clearly shows that a God like that, that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, just couldn't exist. Therefore, God doesn't exist, because we know that evil exists. So it's usually presented as a sort of way of showing that this kind of God can't possibly exist. But even if it turns out that God could exist, even if you could come up with some argument according to which God really does still have all of those properties, and you can reconcile that with the existence of evil somehow. And some people have tried to do this throughout the years. Lots of people who do philosophy of religion have presented lots of kinds of arguments to try to block this move. So they say things like, God really is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-evil, and all good, but he also gave us free will, and so you can explain the existence of evil through human failures, not through God's failures. He gave us free will, and we suck, and that's how all this evil is happening. It's not his fault. And that might be able to capture a certain amount of the evil that's going on in the world, but it really only captures the human stuff. So it might be able to explain why there's murder and genocide and interpersonal mistreatment like that. But it doesn't explain things like natural disasters, earthquakes, storms. There's all manner of awful disease, all manner of awful things that happen to people and that causes suffering that humans had nothing to do with creating. So at the very best, that kind of free will defense is only going to be able to capture some subset of evil. Other people have given arguments. I think he discussed this one in the Crash Course Philosophy video. The reason there's this evil in the world is because God needs us to go through a certain amount of suffering in order to develop as people, to develop our souls. I think this is called the soul-making theodicy. And so if it weren't for the evil in the world, we wouldn't have the opportunity to experience all the good that we experience, and we wouldn't be able to develop into full moral beings. And so we need this evil in order to sort of develop our souls. That's why God put it in the world. But there are still sort of problems that arise with this, and this distinction that he talks about in that CCP video between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil becomes really clear in response to that kind of soul-making move. So the logical problem of evil was just kind of the basic bare bones argument that, okay, God has these three properties, they seem logically inconsistent with the existence of evil, how do we reconcile them? So that's the sort of basic logical problem of evil. But there's also what's called the evidential problem of evil, which is roughly this. It says, okay, look, let's say you're right that, like, for example, a certain amount of evil needs to exist in order for us to fully develop our souls or something, or some certain amount of evil has to exist in order for people to be able to experience true happiness or something like that. It still doesn't explain why there is so much evil. I mean, there are some kinds of evil that seem like they just genuinely serve no purpose. Maybe it's the case that humans have to see some amount of suffering and cruelty in order to, for example, be able to appreciate goodness and treating each other well. But things like the Holocaust that are like an inconceivable amount of suffering. It's like, this feels really gratuitous. This can't possibly be necessary in order for us to develop basic moral skills or something. Like, really 6 million people had to be, systematically exterminated in order for us to know how to be nice to each other. Or there are cases where there's instances of evil and suffering that humans never even know about. I can't remember where I read this example. It's in some classic discussion of the problem of evil. This example is given of, like a small baby deer that's in the forest, and there's a forest fire, and the deer gets trapped in it and gets very badly burned, and lies there for 3 days, just suffering immeasurably. It's just in pain, and it's drawn out. It's very long and sort of slow death, and no person ever comes across the deer, so no one ever finds out about this. how could it possibly be the case that that kind of suffering is really serving some sort of purpose, like forming our souls into, moral beings or whatever? The argument is like, look, even if you could explain some amount of evil by some sort of purpose of turning us into good people or something, it looks like there are just these instances of evil that serve genuinely no purpose, no one even knows about them, and they're just gratuitously horrifying. So that's the evidential problem of evil is, look, we have evidence of like a crazy amount of suffering, and so this explanation of why there's evil in the world that says, okay, look, there's a reason for all of this because God puts it there so that we can benefit in certain ways and blah, blah, blah. It's hard to capture the sheer volume of suffering and evil that exists in the world just through that kind of explanation, because it looks like there's too much suffering for that to really be the purpose of it, especially when so much of it is sort of unknown to us. So that's the basic problem of evil, and the problem of evil comes in with respect to this divine command theory question, because divine command theory, again, is trying to offer an explanation of where morality comes from. It says what morality is just God's will, saying things are right and wrong. But the problem of evil presents this weird puzzle because it says, okay, on one hand, first of all, it seems maybe implausible that actually such a God even exists. So even if that kind of story could be coherent about God willing things to be wrong and them just being wrong, if it's the case that there is no such God, then the theory is empty. It's not tracking anything. But even further than that, there's this sort of worry that even if it's true that there really is a God like that, and you can kind of get over that initial hurdle, now we're left with this world in which there's all this seemingly gratuitous suffering and evil going on. Is it really plausible to think that morality is the will of a God that would allow that kind of suffering to exist? Is that really the author of morality and goodness in the world? This God that would allow sort of gratuitous evil and suffering to go on? So it sort of presents several layers of concern for someone trying to defend this divine command theory. So just sort of to sum up, we've talked about two different arguments against divine command theory. One is this kind of just basic logical argument of the Euthyphro dilemma, that it seems like there's just this weird kind of flip-flopping of the explanation, the order of explanation of where morality comes from. If you say, as the divine command theorist does and as Euthyphro does, what makes something morally right is that God says it's right, it seems like there's this kind of reversal of how the explanation is supposed to go. It seems like instead of that being the case, what's really the case is that God should be picking things that already are good and bad because there's some sort of prior reason for them being good and bad. Things are right because they're already right, not because God says they are. And so God decides that things are right because they already are right, not the other way around. Or else God is just making arbitrary decisions about what's right and wrong, and that doesn't really seem like it captures what morality is about. So that's the Euthyphro dilemma. And then this problem of evil is, okay, look, God is supposed to be all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and yet there's just an extraordinary amount of evil in the world. How do we reconcile those things? And how could it be the case that this system that we think is supposed to be have such sort of moral wisdom in it could be designed by a God that would allow that kind of thing to happen?